across swaths of vast stretches of the African continent to the Horn of Africa, from the Sahel to the Horn of Africa and down the African continent. A deadly threat continues to challenge peace, stability and progress: terrorism. It is a fight that knows no borders, one that demands more than fragmented responses and isolated efforts. For years, nations like Nigeria, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger and Somalia, just to cite this few, have struggled independently to push back against extremist groups. But time seems to be near for a different approach, as recently we saw the Alliance of Sahel State Security Chiefs meeting to discuss the way forward for the creation of a unified force. Forward-looking, could a unified front, an African task force, finally shift the tide on the African continent as far as fighting terrorism is concerned? Today on Talking Points, can a unified African task force effectively combat terrorism in Africa? We ask the tough questions, examine the challenges and explore what real cooperation might look like in the face of an evolving threat. Ladies and gentlemen, you're welcome on board. This is Talking Points over your Pan-African Television. Hello Africa, hello the world. Thank you immensely for tuning in, and this is a Talking Point over your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa, where we talk African matters and beyond. And this time around, we discussing the fight against terrorism on the African continent, a topic that comes in the wake of a recent meeting between the security chiefs of the Alliance of Sahel States as Africa grapples with this threat that continues on a daily basis across the four corners of the African continent. Meanwhile, as Africa strives to overcome this threat that has been looming for a long time, we strive to get solutions on how Africa can move forward. And of course, that leads me to introducing my panel for today. First of all, on the African continent, I'm being joined by Boniface Harrison in his capacity as the Executive Director of MUEMACTION Post. He's joining us all the way from Kenya. Thank you, Mr. Sir, for joining us.
You're welcome, and thank you very much for having me.
Straight out of Africa, we get another guest. Now we just have been joined by Dr. Stanley FONGOD in his capacity as a Pan-Africanist and the CEO of CROSTON FINTECH. Just to reiterate that you are equally an economist. It's a pleasure to have you on board, sir.
Well, thank you so much, Sharon, for having me. Thank my co-partners for joining in as well. And I hope that those who are tuning in, whether by radio or television or streaming, we will be having a very fruitful conversation today.
Indeed, we look forward to fruitful conversations. Like you mentioned, we have been listened over the airways of FM 96.3 for you radio, the Pan-African Radio, and we're streaming live on our social media platforms. Now, to kickstart the conversation, to set the ball rolling, I'll debut with you, Harrison. Terrorism has been plaguing the African continent for a very long time. If we take countries like Nigeria, that has had, to deal with this threat for decades. At this point in time, we have countries like Somalia that are still very much battling with this bone. But then, how would you assess the current state of terrorism across the different African regions, particularly in the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, East Africa, to get to, taste a little bit of this sour poison, which we call terrorism on the African continent? How do you assess this vis-a-vis, how Africa has stood the test of time?
Yeah, thank you, Sharon, for the wonderful introduction. And rightly, Africa has become a hotspot for terrorism, with growing insurgencies in the Sahel, Horn of Africa, the Great Lakes region, and parts of Southern Africa, including Eastern Africa as well, because of countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is currently in a conflict. And this has been due to groups like Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, ISIS affiliates, the local militias, which have continued to exploit weak governance and also leveraging on poverty. Because, for example, I was seeing recently on a video in DRC where people were celebrating seeing some militias coming to quote unquote help them. There's a lot of misunderstandings and dynamics that are in the militias that exist in the countries that are war torn, and the porous borders have also been a cause for the continued trend of conflicts in Africa. And the effects of terrorism have been very adverse, of course, because terrorism not only threatens the lives, but it also disrupts development, it deepens displacement, and undermines democracy and stability. Terrorism indeed has been a huge blow to the African continent, and as PLO Lumumba keeps saying, that it's important for the guns to be silent in Africa. But the question remains, why have guns never become silent in Africa? Why do people still continue to fight? So really, drawing context, Africa has been affected by terrorism from all different angles and demographic. So that is what I would say about the overall view of terrorism in Africa.
Thank you, Mansley Harrison. Just to say that while we ask ourselves the questions, it's important to silence the guns on the African continent. We ask, who's supposed to silence these guns? You know, what measures, what parameters have been put in place to ensure that this dream comes to reality? Now, taking an example like Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Dr. FONGOD, we have seen countries from an individual perspective try to silence these guns, try to curb terrorism at their respective levels. Now, what have been the main challenges that these individual countries have recorded so far in their combat against terrorism? And how many of these efforts, you know, struggled to achieve long-term success? Let's take an example, Nigeria, the DRC, Somalia, for instance, that the nation recently announced that they are making significant strides in that domain.
I think that the only way in which we can significantly talk about any kind of changes, especially when it comes to terrorist activities on the continent of Africa, will have to be at the face of education. And the reason for that is because if you look at the terrorist groups that are absolutely operating on the African continent, they are all affiliated with Islam. So Islamic terrorism on the continent of Africa is hot. It's extremely quite dangerous. There were terrorist groups, normally by then we're not calling them terrorist groups, we will call them militias, especially in places like the DRC. But of recent, you know, there are militia groups in DRC that are now in partnership with ISIS, and now the whole entire ideology has shifted from something that was supposed to be maybe a political issue to something that is now more religious. The most dangerous person to have any kind of conflict with is the person who believes that they are fighting for a greater power, is the individual who believes that what is that is the bone of contention has some kind of a spiritual connotation to it, and that in itself is extremely dangerous. So I do believe that if we will have to be able to talk about finding ways on the continent of Africa to put an end to this level of madness, we must do so actually from an educational perspective. And the reason for that is because we need to get people to fully understand that dialogue is what matters, that the reality is that any kind of utopia that anyone is looking for based upon some form of a religious war, it's absolutely demented, and it's something else that we need to absolutely defeat, not just with the barrel of a gun, but we need to defeat that from the levels of the mind. We have to get people to fully understand that the only religion that truly matters is humanity. And the reason why I say so is because even in Islam, they have converts, they have people that, you know, basically converts into Islam. They are human beings, they are not dogs that convert into Islam. Likewise with Christianity, they are not animals that convert into Christianity, they're humans. So the very first religion everyone is introduced to when they come to this, you know, to this life, when they are born, is to this religion called humanity. It's the human race. The reality is that any day that, you know, we lose our humanity, there will be absolutely no religion that will be able to save us.
Now, if I'm getting you, Dr. Fongod, a lot of, reasons push people to divert into, being terrorists. And of course, we're having such conversations to be able to, look for solutions around all this, especially what is plaguing the African continent, which just reiterate that lives have been lost, through this violence on the African continent. But then I'll shift away from you. I'll be coming back to you, pick up from there. Harrison, you listen to your co-panelists, but there is this renewed call that has been, for decades on the African continent. Back when we saw the African Union brought the agenda of silencing the guns within the context of the African continent, 2020 to 2030, which it has been shifted. Up to date, we still have the same problem. But why do you think there is still this growing push for a unified African, security response in the wake of this terrorism threat that Africa is facing?
Great. Part of the reasons why we are still talking about divided fronts when addressing conflicts is because of, number one, sovereignty concerns. Because there has been limited cooperation between African countries where, for example, recently there's a militia group associated with violence in Sudan, and in a way they found themselves in another country where they had a big meeting recently. I believe that is information that is in the public domain already, because I don't want to be quoted diplomatically. So they went to launch their parallel government in another country, in a city. And now concerns have already arisen from that, and South Sudan is actually saying that the other country has infringed their sovereignty, and they have already started issuing sanctions against the other country. And so that is a problem that has existed, because now these countries are supposed to be working together towards achieving peace in Sudan, yet now they are fighting against each other because of sovereignty issues and power issues, and who is independent and who should not meddle in each other's business. The other concern has been different national priorities among the member states of AU, or rather countries in Africa. Priorities are different. You can see, for example, how the Africa Free Trade FCTA has taken a lot of time to be ratified, because some countries don't have similar interests and aspirations as others. So it happens even when addressing conflicts. Sometimes you'll find that other countries are accused of having interest in certain countries, like gold smuggling and other minerals. You'll hear that a country is being accused of stealing minerals from another country. And now that makes it a challenge, because it means there's a country that is benefiting from another country's suffering. The other challenge has been lack of funding, inadequate funding for peacekeeping missions in Africa, because peacekeeping needs resources, and now we end up over-relying on foreign aid, for example, from the European Union, the United States, France, and even Russia these days. And so this over-dependence makes it a challenge to find sustainable solutions to the challenges of insecurity that we have in Africa, because often when we have alliances with other countries, foreign countries, they also come with their own interest. And now that means that we are helped, quote unquote, in one hand, and there is something we have to give on the other hand. Because I saw recently when, for example, the president of Kenya was mentioning that he had spoken to Macron, there's a lot of uproar about why would the president of Kenya talk to Macron about the situation in DRC. But when you look at it, the situation really is that funding is very limited. For example, recently our president, when he was in America, he was given a lot of funding and jets and other equipments by the United States to Kenya. Now, the question is, are we able to afford those resources if we are not given? The answer is we need them. Can we afford them? We are already in serious debt. Yeah, the citizens are also rejecting over taxation. So how best is huge corruption in government? So how best can we afford these resources to prepare ourselves? We end up over relying on foreign actors. Mistrust, as earlier mentioned, between countries has been a challenge. Finally, there has been the issue of militarization. Sometimes you will hear perspectives about the situation in DRC. Some people will say this situation needs a crackdown, a military crackdown, where these terrorists are chased away from or are finished completely from DRC or from causing human suffering. Other people will say the only way to resolving this conflict is dialogue. So there is that confusion. Because some conflicts that exist in Africa that lead to terror are actually anchored on deeper root causes, like inequality. Some people might feel sidelined from the government, youth unemployment, sometimes even how easy it is for example, Al-Shabaab to get more recruits is because young people are unemployed. When they get an opportunity for them to get something, they get easily carried to it. So that's another root cause that makes it very complicated to address the root causes of terrorism in Africa and poor governance. Sometimes leaders do not want to have dialogue with dissenting voices. And so, like recently in Kenya, when there were the Gen Z protests on the evening when the president was addressing the nation, the people who had broken into parliament were referred to as treasonous criminals. Yeah, and when you look at it, it's a result of governance, youth unemployment, feelings of inequality, and surely, if such a trend continues in a country, it may lead to very great risks in terms of security and stability of that country. So those, I would say, are the, of course, without overemphasis on the African Union, because African Union faces the same challenges that I've highlighted previously, because it's been a challenge for the AU to actually unite Africa due to the same challenges: mistrust, over militarization, over dependency on foreign aid. Because it reaches a point where even the AU cannot finance its own activities. They rely on funding from the UN. Yeah, you heard that there were some what were they called? There were some groups of mercenaries. There were mercenaries who are from abroad who are in DRC, and it was said that they have to be removed. The situation needs to be handled in an easier way than a use of mercenaries. That mercenaries have never caused peace anywhere. There was that conversation. So those are some of the dynamics that have led to it being very difficult to adopt a peaceful Africa. And finally, maybe it's because these terrorists continue to get funding and resources from whatever sources. Yeah. Sometimes even quarters in governments are the ones that surrender information to terrorists. Yeah, there are people who have been committed to funding terrorism sustainably across the world. So that's a big challenge. That's a big challenge because sometimes even countries might end up funding violence to another country by creating an environment that terrorists can thrive. For example, if a perceived terrorist terrorists is finding residents in another country and implementing their activities from there, that means that country is facilitating terrorism to the other. So those are the dynamics that I can pinpoint.
Thank you immensely, Harrison. Just to reiterate, you mentioned, that it's important for countries to set their priorities straight. And of course, I believe that this issue of terrorism is something that does not just affect individual African countries, but touches the African continent as a whole. Now, Dr. FONGOD, you listen to your co-panelist who shares the opinion that it's important for, African countries to come together, but I think it depends on whoever's priorities that is. From your perspective, having listened to him, what might be driving this shift at this particular point in time? And from that, it's often said that unity is strength on the African continent. But will a unified force on the African continent go a long way in creating some sort of channel to boost solidarity, something that might be missing, within the puzzle amongst African countries?
Yes, for sure. I think that we have to find ways in which we basically operate together on the continent of Africa, so that we can be able to curb this issue that is of this terrorist activities that is taking place on the continent. But for us to do so, we need to fully understand exactly what we're dealing with. Two major groups are operating on the continent of Africa, and they are basically, the creme de la creme of terrorist organizations. We are talking about ISIS, and we are talking also about Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has this ideology, which is a little bit more subtle, that they come into a community, they operate community by community to bring their ideology, but they work with the people. So Al-Qaeda is not really like ISIS. Al-Qaeda will come in a very subtle way and will try as much as they can to convince people and then to win people over. They basically carry out this evangelistic move, in trying to win converts. When it comes to ISIS, ISIS is more militant. ISIS is more diabolic. They will use the most ruthless, cruel method you can think of, beheadings and God knows everything in between, to win people over. That's what ISIS does. So those two groups are absolutely fully functional in Africa. You're talking about areas like Sahel, you're talking about Central African Republic, you're talking about the East African community, you're talking about as far in South Africa as Tanzania and Mozambique. These, terrorist groups are actually operating out there. The reality is this, that if you look at what is happening with the recruitment, they are actually getting communities that are totally disenfranchised. They are getting people who basically have something, a bone of contention to grant with the government or some form of, or whatever authority that they are under. And that is the reality of the issues that we are facing, on the continent. So I think in more ways, and I think that my co-panelists mentioned that if there was going to be a way in which we can collectively solve the issues we are having on the continent of Africa, we must do so with dialogue. We must do so with a lot of education and find ways in which we can be able to alleviate the poverty levels in these communities. If we bring in the right skill sets, if we are able to educate young people in the right things and then get them to work immediately, then that will be there will be no incentive for them to be able to join this promised utopia that will never come. And the reality is that these things will die on arrival. First of all, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, it has no bearing on the continent of Africa. It's not even African. These are foreign ideas, quite cancerous in nature, that has come from the Middle East and that Africa is absolutely suffering from. And I also think that we need to be able to hold good Islam, I'm talking about good clerics in the Islamic community, to be able to stand up and try as much as they can to put an end to this trash, because the reality is this: it affects everybody. There are Muslims that are dying as a result of these terrorist activities, and there are non-Muslims that are dying also. These guys could care less as long as it's to meet up with whatever their ideology and agenda is. That's what matters. So we must be able able to make sure that no one shies away from calling this evil what it is. We have to be able to have broad consensus, when it means to condemn evil, and find ways also to make sure that we get those that are, quite ripe to be basically recruited into these, systems to not be. We have to give them alternative routes, alternative path. We must be able to make sure that these are folks who are not that disenfranchised, that they would join groups like this. So that is the thing that I think that on the African continent we must be able to push for. With that, which this terrorist thing, Islamic terrorism, it's quite pervasive. It's ruthless. It's like cancer. And whenever you identify a cell, what you need to do is to come with a scalpel, and if need be, you probably come with the axe if things get bad, because somehow you got to cut it immediately.
Now, I'll be staying with you, Dr. FONGOD. You mentioned that we need to understand what we are up against, and having understood the root causes, do you think that it's preferable that this unified force will go a long way in succeeding where previous forces have failed? And do you think that there is really need for the necessity for us to, evaluate the lapses that have been recorded in the past as far as, eradicating this canker worm from the African continent is concerned?
Absolutely, and the reason for that is because any unified force basically means that the intelligence gathering will have to be shared, which means that we are sharing intelligence from many countries that are part of this unified force. For example, if you look at what is happening in the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, those countries are under constant attack from terrorist organizations roaming through the Sahara, most of which were inspired by the fall of Libya, and now we have guns, all kinds of IEDs that are being used in the Sahel to just wreak terror. Now, if you are going to have some kind of a unified force, what that literally means is that intelligence gathering, especially when it has to do with terrorism, is extremely very important, because you can have a splinter group somewhere in Niger that is basically in communication with another group in Mali. By virtue of the fact that the group in Niger falls, you can be able to get enough information across, potential activities or people that are involved in those other countries, in Burkina Faso, in Mali, that you otherwise would not have if there was not intelligence gathering. And I think that having a unified force is extremely very important, if not just for the intelligence gathering aspect of it, which will be a broad perspective, because remember, there is not really an army that you're after. You're after people. In most countries, this will just be regular individuals, and you have no idea they have been radicalized. You have no idea that you're dealing with an enemy, and it's only when they really are activated that they will go out and attack. You need to find these people long before they get activated, long before they launch an attack. And I think that intelligence gathering will be of prime importance, and that means that a unified force will basically set the precedent to which it is that intelligence gathering is possible to share, because most countries just don't share those kinds of intelligence, especially because they're thinking about national security and all kinds of implications or methods and in which they use in collecting this information. So we have to be able to make sure that we share information and have some kind of a unified force on the continent of Africa to help us solve this issue. If the Horn of Africa really had taken this thing a little bit more seriously, in partnership with Kenya, Somalia, and all those other countries in the Horn of Africa, things would have been extremely quite difficult, for these groups to have moved south up to areas of Tanzania and Mozambique. So we need to be able to find ways, in which we really work together. If not, things will be a little bit quite difficult. Remember, these guys are, crusading. They are absolutely evangelizing. They're doing whatever it takes to get people on their side. And the reality is nobody wins in the end.
Exactly, nobody wins in the end, and I'm very fond of this African adage that says a divided house cannot stand, which means unity is strength. You know, it's all about collective efforts for greater good. Now, Harrison, you listen to your co-panelist, who shares the view that it's important for African forces to come together because intelligence gathering and intelligence sharing is paramount in this fight for Africa to be able to win. Now, when we look at experiences from past joint forces on the African continent, you know, I spoke earlier on of Somalia, where the President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud, speaking at the diplomacy or Antalya Diplomacy Forum in Turkey recently, affirmed that the country had made significant strides as far as, you know, reducing the attacks from terrorist groups, especially Al-Shabaab in that country is concerned. But now, vis-a-vis some of these attacks that keep coming on African countries, what lessons could be learned, could be drawn from existing joint initiatives within the context of Africa, like the G5 Sahel before it was actually dissolved, you know, with the withdrawal of the three countries of the Alliance of Sahel States and others, with the multinational joint task force. We're equally looking at the multi-dimensional force of the African Union that is expected to leave with the coming in of AUSOM in Somalia, amidst others. How can we, you know, draw experiences from this past joint initiatives for future prospects in a bid to win this fight against terrorism on the African continent?
Great. Very good question, because definitely we have come from somewhere. We have a story as a continent.
Exactly.
And it's only wise if we can look back and learn from what we have already done before. The situation that we have at hand is that conflict and terrorism are still prevalent in Africa, and it's therefore urgent and important that we continue to make efforts to make Africa more secure and each respective country more stable. I think from what has been done before, first of all, the challenge that we need to fix in our continent is governance. We really need to have a working democracy in each country, because anytime the principles of democracy are breached, then it leads the countries to instability. Look at, for example, what has happened in Sudan since 2010-11. What has been happening in DRC is also governance related. What's happening in Sahel is governance related. So really we need to fix our politics as a continent. We need to desist from the culture of greed and division that we have been used to as Africans in elections. It's always big news to see, for example, a leader conceding defeat in an election. Most times when leaders are defeated in elections, and that's because of deeper issues like lack of credibility with our electoral bodies. But we need to change that. We have to fix that, because if we continue disagreeing and fighting over positions, then it's going to be a challenge to achieve stability in Africa, because everyone will want to pull their side. They'll mobilize resources, they'll establish allies, planning to remove the existing leader. And then that cycle continues. So that's the first thing we need to do. And we can do this by cultivating a culture of contentment, yeah, and patriotism. Mm-hmm. We don't see these a lot in foreign countries, for example, until maybe when Trump was not announced the winner in the previous election, and there was a little bit of fracas at White House. But we haven't seen this in many other countries, and I think it's time for Africa. We also saw history in Kenya, although the election was still contested, but it was contested in court. So if we can have such amicable ways of resolving electoral disputes, that will be one thing. Somalia, for example, is a time when Somalia was declared a failed state, because of governance issues. And you know, all the time, when a country has not fixed its governance issues, terrorists will always find a safe haven in that country, because it means the systems are not working. You will find that the security systems are also divided, resources are available. The citizens themselves are also in a mood that is prone to violence. The other recommendation I would make based on the previous experiences is a youth-focused counter-extremism programs, because look at Africa and the militia groups that exist. It's young people. It's young people who are recruited to these militia groups. Some of them are not in these groups because they believe in what these militia groups do. Some have been brainwashed into them. Others have been promised greener pastures in those militia groups. And so it's important to ensure that we put practical strategies to counter the recruitment of youth in countries into terrorism. It's said that the future of a country relies on the strength of its young people. And that's true. The same way, the downfall of a country can be delivered very well by young people. They say also that when a child does not feel warmth from their village, they might end up burning the village so that they can feel the warmth from the fire from the village. So we need to find ways. Look at the Gen Z uprising that was getting momentum last year. That is close to a sign of children wanting to bask in the heat of their village, and that needs to be fixed, because there are systemic issues like unemployment, and feelings of inequality and division. These are some of the issues that need to be well tackled, because we are not going to promote tribalism. We're not going to remain unintentional about creating jobs and expect that young people will not get angry. It reaches a point that is very alarming. We recently had a meeting with the head of National Intelligence Service in Kenya, and it was a consultative, not actually consultative, it was a public lecture where they were delivering the landscape and the changes that have happened in the security systems in Kenya. And the conversation was also around how sometimes young people feel dissent to the point of even wishing the worst for their country. You find a young person wishing that the government systems crumble and collapse because they feel that the government of the day is not delivering to their promise. So those are the issues that we need to actually very much focus on. The other issue is on inclusion of the communities and early warning systems to communities. Because areas, for example, in Kenya, like areas like Mombasa and Pwani, in the coast region, the region that is close to Somalia, you find that the area is prone to attacks and settings of landmines by the Al-Shabaab. And the community sometimes is not well equipped to identify potential criminals and terrorists who have come to their community. And some will ignore and say, okay, it's just people who have come over, or they will get afraid, or they don't have a platform where they can submit this information that there are some new people that we suspect could be terrorists. So by the time the security systems will get to know about a terrorist who has been in a place, it's definitely because of an incident. That needs to stop. We need to continue empowering communities with knowledge and resources and tools that they can use to create awareness to actually deliver information and give local intelligence about what they are seeing. And we have seen areas, programs like, for example, in Kenya, a program called Nyumba Kumi. Nyumba Kumi means 10 houses. Yeah, Nyumba Kumi means 10 houses. So it means every 10 houses have a leader in the village. So that creates some kind of community organization where people can easily communicate with one another and take collective action. That's very important. And finally, maybe to just save on time as well, I would recommend more domestic funding towards securing the borders of our countries. Because the more we continue depending on foreign aid and foreign actors, the more this thing is not going to be sustainable. Because anytime a foreign actor notices that they're benefiting from a conflict, they may be hesitant to put it to an end. And that means suffering will continue because someone is benefiting from it. So my recommendation is that we need to, of course, increasing domestic funding comes with other aspects like reducing debt that countries have, also cutting corruption that is rampant in governments, so that, and creating investments in respective countries so that we can have resources to finance our own security. Because if we cannot finance our own security, someone will do. And if a person controls our security, then we are totally dependent on that person. They can determine our life. They can determine, there's a certain phrase that we used to say a lot when we were in campus, where we used to say that sometimes when we want to agitate for something, we say, you know, sometimes students are the source of security and also the source of insecurity. So when you solely depend on a person to provide your security, they can be source of your security and they can also create insecurity for you, because that's a person who has wielded full control over it. So those are the recommendations that I would highly recommend. There is a lot more that we can do, but that's my take for now.
Thank you so much. But you mentioned a lot of powerful points, and I would like to kickstart from there. You mentioned domestic funding. Looking at what's happening, I believe you mentioned this issue of Africa being able to, you know, fund its own tools to be able to combat security or insecurity on the African continent. But how can we raise those funds to, you know, to curb terrorism within the context of Africa if we have this lack of political will? Like in your previous response, you highlighted that it was a matter of priorities of the respective nations. So how do we mitigate all this, you know, these challenges to be able to get to a point where Africa can fund its own initiatives that would drive, you know, security on the African continent?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges towards countries even committing resources to ensuring security of other countries is because of shortage of resources. For example, we have had a lot of debate in Kenya because our Kenyan troops are in Haiti. They are in the UN peacekeeping mission in Haiti. And the debate has been, why are our troops in Haiti and we still have insecurity in Kenya? Where are we spending money on Haiti? And that is, for example, kind of a debate that has been happening in Kenya. And that is the same. There are always debates about why are we investing in this country and we don't have interest there. Why? So that's number one. Interests, as you rightly mentioned, as I rightly mentioned as well, are a challenge. But now we need to, as we have said here before, we need to have some kind of firm leadership in the African Union and in the African continent, where priorities can be discussed. I think it was in this same forum where we discussed that our whole AU meeting was held in Addis Ababa and never discussed the conflict, the war in DRC.
True.
Imagine. That oversight is really alarming. So if we are going to reach the point, before we get to the point of allocating resources domestically, can we, first of all, agree on what is the priority for us as a continent? We might have different priorities as different countries, but what brings us to Addis? What brings us to Addis is because we are AU. Then as AU, what is our priority? Then what are our commitments to that? Now, our commitments for us to finance our domestic peacekeeping missions, what do we need to do? We need to pay our debts. We need to be free from debt. If we are going to remain in debt as Africans and not growing our investments and not utilizing our resources properly, for example, like we have minerals, we have agricultural products that we need to see how we can generate money from them. Because the people who fund terrorism, where do they get money from? They're business people, they are cartels, yeah? They run the biggest money-generating businesses and dark businesses that could ever exist. So we are on a race with the terrorists. Who mobilizes the most resources to get the most sophisticated weapons? So we must be very serious about generating money for our countries. And also, actually, the other point that came up during the recent meeting I mentioned that we had with the intelligence department in our country was that infrastructure development is a key to security. In this way, that when an area has roads, it has electricity, it has a town nearby, such that the facilities like healthcare facilities are accessible, that area automatically becomes secure, more secure, as opposed to areas that are underdeveloped, because you find that
deserted.
most terrorist operations are done in areas that are rural and underdeveloped. When you look at even the areas that are more prone to violence in DRC, are the rural areas that have not been well developed. So internally, if we can be deliberate about infrastructure development in our countries, that will in turn improve security, because we are not able to secure people who are not accessible. Just like, for example, a place has no network, has no electricity. Those people can't even report that they have seen terrorists. So those are some of the things that I would think internally. But the biggest hurdle that we might face is the AU leadership. And I have deliberately sometimes avoided talking about the AU because the magic that can happen from there is just from whoever holds the office now. They have the responsibility to chart the way forward for AU. And I think as countries, as people from different countries, we can push our respective governments about some of the issues that we have mentioned.
Thank you, Mentally. Now back to you, Dr. FONGOD. You see what's happening within the Sahel region, especially within the Alliance of Sahel States. We cannot give a blind eye to the fact that the recent happenings within this newly created bloc has been some sort of eye-opener to the regional bloc, the ECOWAS. And recently, as ECOWAS plans to celebrate its 50th anniversary, they were reiterating the need for them to work towards ensuring stability, ensuring security within the region. Now, with this recent meeting being held, after listening to your co-panelists, with this recent meeting being held between the security chiefs of these three countries, do you think that's going to go a long way in being some sort of turning points, as he has been for ECOWAS, expanding itself to the African continent to chart a way forward on how, Africans can be able to, target or set their priorities straight and target this issue of terrorism? And equally, the next question I'll be equally highlighting is, can African countries, defer their national interest to collaborate on security?
Well, no. Probably I take the last question. I don't think that we have to absolutely even outsource anything, if that's what you meant. If we can't not outsource national security to anybody else, and we cannot also defer it in relationship to probably pushing it forward for another day, that will not happen. I do believe sincerely that security is of utmost importance, especially on the African continent. If you look at Africa from the outside, if you are offshore and you look at Africa from the outside, there are three very bleak images that you see. You see famine, you see starvation, and you see war. That is the image that the world actually looks at. That's the lens through which the world basically looks at Africa. And the sheer level of disrespect that the world has so far as the continent is concerned, especially coming from those in leadership of other countries, and those who are basically funding all kinds of operations on the continent of Africa, they do so with a lot of disdain because, so far as they're concerned, they're actually helping the people who are helpless. But the reality is that that's not our story. That's not who we are. We have to be able to make sure that we handle our issues by ourselves. And I think that, over and over, I've said this time and time again, that the salvation of the continent is not offshore, it's onshore. The salvation of the continent is not coming from Washington, D.C., neither is it coming from Paris, not London. The salvation, not even Beijing, is not coming from Moscow. The salvation of Africa is going to be coming from places like Timbuktu. It will come from places like Mogadishu. It will come from places like Douala. It will be from places like Yaoundé. It will be from, from Lagos, from Accra, all right, from Nairobi. We have to be able to fully understand that, and that whoever we are waiting for is on the continent of Africa. The person does not have to come from outside of the continent of Africa. I do believe that an African is waiting in the wings to be able to help us overcome these different challenges that we do face. A collaboration like the one we see happening in the Sahel is the template to which it is that Africa needs to basically emerge. The reality is that when you look at what is happening in the Sahel, these are people who have been pushed to the fringes, and they have been pushed actually to the wall, and they have fully understood that if there has to be anything that needs to be done to deliver their territory from the hands of Islamic jihadist terrorists, they have to do so, basically aligning themselves together, building a coalition that will be able to fight off these invaders. And that is the only way in which we can be able to achieve this on the continent of Africa. If you look at northern Cameroon with Boko Haram, we're talking about Nigeria, Cameroon, and Chad, within the Chad basin, which basically it's the roaming ground for Boko Haram and now ISIS. We have to be able to make sure, no matter what, that we basically create a coalition big enough between Chad, Nigeria, and which is basically taking place as we speak between Chad, Nigeria, and Cameroon, to be able to make sure that we fight this insurgency that is taking place in the northern part of Cameroon, Nigeria, and part of Chad. Without which it will be extremely quite difficult for us to talk about having made any kind of progress in curbing terrorist activities that is taking place on the continent of Africa. I secondly do believe that for us to basically have a free day, a day where Africa is free, a day where Africa basically is free from every terrorist attack, it will be that day when young Africans, whether you are from the most Islamic belt, the Arab belt, the Sahel, or you're somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, wherever you are on the continent of Africa, your ideas about life will not be morphed by some French ideology on Islam. It will be morphed by the fact that you are given the opportunity to excel in your community, where you love your ancestors, where you love the land to which it is that you have been given, where you love the fact that you were born in the place in which you were born in, not because it was a mistake, some freak of nature. It is just that you came with unique sets of skills to be able to harness what is it that is God given within you to serve the community society to which it is that you have been born in. And I don't believe for one second that anyone who is in some of the most dire spots on planet Earth should be able to look at the circumstances in which they are in and think that the only way out of that is to be able to kill somebody just so that they can be able to enjoy some utopia that is coming. Weak men do that. Weak people do that. Only people who basically are quite weak will be able to consider that to be, anything of any importance. If you're strong and if you really are quite strong, you will be able to navigate whatever terrain that you have been placed in, because you know without a shadow of a doubt that that's what is it that you were born to do. And I think that the moment we begin to inspire young people, especially in these areas, and give them the tools, inspiration, without, giving them some kind of a roadmap as to how they can be able to become the best that they can be in the environments that they're in, will means nothing. I think that we need to be able to inspire young people and then provide them with a roadmap of escape, not escaping the region, but escaping this stalemate that their lives has been plunged into, where they begin to become productive members of society, where they absolutely create businesses, become young entrepreneurs. Hopefully they build those ones into small to medium-sized enterprises and become, big major players in the economic scene. I think that those are things that we should do and encourage. That being said, the government has a huge part to play in this, which will be to make sure that the type of education that young people are being given, is the education that will prepare them to the job, for the job market, educations that are geared towards self-reliance studies, so that when you eventually get out of school, you have the capacity to do the things that you have learned in school without waiting for somebody to show up with an employment slip. That in itself is self-defeating. And I think that we need to be able to prepare our young people for the job market in the 21st century, and that will indeed help us with the issues of recruitment so far as these terrorist groups are concerned.
Exactly, and of course, I would like to continue with you, Dr. FONGOD, but then, dear audience, ladies and gentlemen, if you're just stopping by, this is Talking Point over your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. We're discussing the fight against terrorism on the African continent, evaluating the role of a unified task force on the continent of Africa. Now, Dr. FONGOD, you mentioned that it's not supposed to be an option to have external, actors participate in trying to take the baton of command as far as Africa's security is concerned. But nonetheless, we could not sideline the fact that it's important for Africa to collaborate. While a nation like Mozambique went in for collaboration with Rwanda and other regional forces, we equally saw Somalia that decided to, though it tapped in resource, it tapped in a collaboration, help from other African countries. It equally solicited the help from Turkey. And then when you look at the countries of the Alliance of Sahel states, they decided to sway away from France and went towards Russia. Now, how can Africa as a continent, navigate the involvement of all these external factors, external actors like France, the United States, Russia, China, in its anti-terrorism strategies, so that at the end of the day, it is Africa that is trying to defend Africa and not external actors trying to defend the continent?
During the Obama administration, the administration reached out to Nigeria, and they wanted to be able to set up a military base in Nigeria, which was swiftly rejected. And thereafter, Boko Haram became Boko Haram. And it's recently, during the Trump administration, just a couple of months ago, about a month ago, that we finally understood what was going on. There were local reports in Nigeria within the Truth-Finding Commission that was set up in Nigeria. I don't know exactly what the commission was. The name of the commission was, I've forgotten. But it was part of the report from that commission stated that locals used to see helicopters with white men landing with Boko Haram, landing in Boko Haram territory and uploading monies and guns and all kinds of stuff. We now recently learned from a congressman in the United States of America that the United States was actually sponsoring Boko Haram to the tunes of millions of US dollars. So the notion that we have to be able to allow anyone, for that matter, to show up on the continent of Africa and to help us on the issues of security, is laughable. I think that there has to be a concerted effort on the continent of Africa for each and every one of us, every country on the continent of Africa, to fight this thing to the last man standing. Africa is quite placed at a unique vantage point, and I think that if we can do this properly, even if those in the northern belt, we're talking about Tunisia, Morocco, Libya, if those countries basically do not want to have anything to do with those of us in sub-Saharan Africa, that's okay. We have the Sahara, and I think that the Sahara would act as a buffer, and then those who are in countries like in the Sahelan region should be able to have a serious resistant force to make sure that all the cancer infiltrating through the Sahara from places like Libya do not show up on the continent of Africa. We are uniquely placed in the world, which means that we are somewhat a little bit uniquely placed in such a way that it will be quite difficult for any invading soldiers to come in from outside of the continent of Africa to do us much harm on the continent of Africa, because they have to come by vessels, and frankly speaking, the coastline on the continent of Africa is not that forgiving. That being said, we must collaborate together. The notion about Russia, the notion about China or any other country is Turkey. It doesn't matter who you call. The reality is they are non-Africans, and whatever they do it to the interest of their nations. And because of that, we have to be able to know that a day will come that they will treat us like Obama did Nigeria, obviously Cameroon, and now Chad, because of the atrocities committed by Boko Haram in those areas. And yet no one is talking about it. Nobody is saying anything about it. And that is what I fear. We have to be responsible for our own security. If not, I guarantee you, the pain will be ours, not theirs.
And I think that is a common ground. But I know both of you, both panelists have agreed that Africa needs to be responsible for its own security. Now, down memory lane, there have been, numerous reports that, the MONUSCO that was in Congo, the UN peacekeeping mission, had committed several atrocities, which we might not, get into detail because that's not our topic of discussion. But then, Harrison, you listen to your co-panelists. How can a unified task force on the African continent ensure that it respects human rights, it respects or it avoids civilian harm and gains trust in the respective nations across, amongst the local population?
Right. A unified approach towards countering terrorism in Africa can take diverse ways to ensure that it's credible and trusted by communities, as we have rightly mentioned. And first of all, for it to be an effective formation, these conflicts ought to be real conflicts. Yeah, because anytime we have fake conflicts, for example, fake conflict could be
exactly
a politician who disagrees with another, then they go out, sometimes they're even accused of colluding to cause unrest in a country so that they can together loot on something that they are planning. So they see it as a way to keep people busy. So first, these conflicts need to be real and genuine. Yeah, because then we start from a credible point of view. And secondly is that there needs to be a lot of internal coordination and initiative. Because when we see discussions about peace for a certain country and people from that country are themselves not there, that makes it challenging for people to believe that peace missions are really well-meaning. So involvement and domestic solutions need to be found. For example, in Kenya in 2007, when there was a post-election disagreement, the solutions were born internally with the help of the then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. He came to Kenya, met the two sides of the divide, and they brokered a deal to ensure stability. So that's the other aspect. We need to ensure internal efforts are utilized to the last breath. That's the other thing. The other aspect to make these efforts credible is now not over-relying on foreign actors. Because when a peacekeeping mission, as Dr. FONGOD was mentioning, you see white people, you see people from other places, it starts sparking controversies. For example, there was a time when soldiers of a different country were in a peacekeeping mission in DRC, and they were accused of smuggling gold. They'll say that they were there to smuggle gold. When you see Russian soldiers or American soldiers, they'll be accused of being part of something, yeah? So it's important to, of course, we cannot live as islands, but we need to find a way to detach from over-reliance of foreign aid. The other thing to make these missions credible is to institutionalize them. Let's institutionalize them in our governments, in our policies, to ensure that such task forces are recognized by governments, to make them even fundable by the local country's budget. Because when we have missions that, for example, in Kenya, like the Haiti mission, had to go through parliament to be discussed and for approvals and everything. And it became a whole debate. So it's important to create such opportunities for collaboration across African countries in each country. Another biggest problem that we normally have in countries in Africa is this issue of ratification, where it takes years to ratify something that has been proposed for the benefit of the entire country. So those are some of the things I think, when applied, can make unified task forces credible and more sustainable and appreciated by the communities.
That was Boniface Harrison, Executive Director of MUEMACTION Post from Kenya. Meanwhile, back to you, Dr. FONGOD. I guess this should be the last question before we draw down the curtains of today's edition of the program. Though we acknowledge the fact that, all these non-military strategies, like job creation, education, which was earlier on brought forth, community dialogue, as stated by a co-panelist, would go a long way in combating terrorism on the African continent, we equally, we came to a common ground, highlighting that a unified African task force is a dream within the context of Africa and can actually be realized. But the last question I'd like to ask you before we wrap up today's edition is, if we finally succeed in creating this unified African force, task force on the African continent, what would the success, how could we be able to measure the success, say from 5 to 10 years from now, in a bid to ensure that it has been able, to achieve or attain its own objectives for which it was created?
I think if you look at a place like the Sahel, where terrorist activities is basically quite rampant, if you look at places like Timbuktu, where ancient manuscripts that are so dear and treasured, by Africans, and it's also important to understand that most of those manuscripts were written by Islamic scholars, between the 7th and the 14th century. This is not even Christian texts; these are Islamic texts, ancient manuscripts. manuscripts written by Islamic scholars, scientists, mathematicians, out of places like Sankore University, the first university, one of the very first universities in the world, one of the very first universities on the continent of Africa. People used to leave Europe to come and study in Africa. If you understand that we have such treasures, all right, on the continent of Africa, and if you also understand that a French group like ISIS, recently has been burning those ancient manuscripts, okay, men who were just, people in their 30s, folks in their 20s, all right, burning ancient manuscripts that predates them hundreds of years. We are talking about 400, 500, 600, 700 years, some 800 years. That in itself is quite disturbing, very, very disturbing. So I think that one of the gains we will be able to make on the continent of Africa will be that we actually preserve most of what is it that is of cultural heritage to us, that we preserve the integrity of who we are as a people in relationship to what we have been able to create or what our ancestors absolutely did. I think that we must be able to fight to make sure that whatever we have on the continent of Africa, including the Pyramid of Egypt, including the Great Walls of Zimbabwe, including artifacts in places like Benin in Nigeria, including manuscripts in places like Timbuktu, we have to be able to make sure that we hold those things sacred. And the reason for that is because that is our ancestry. That is who we are. The gains we are going to measure is not just that the sound of an AK-47 stops sounding. It's not just IEDs basically stop going off. It's not just that we had young people who basically stopped, from joining ISIS or Al-Qaeda. It is that we had young people on the continent of Africa that became Pan-Africans with an Afrocentric mindset, deeply in love with the continent of Africa to give us, the best version of the continent going forward. The reality is that we are in love with who we are as a people, but the future of the continent of Africa is in the hands of those who are now being recruited by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And the reality is that we have to fight that for the salvation of the continent going forward, we have people who are liberated from this oppression that is coming in from the Middle East. And it is also safe for me now to say that the worst form of atrocity that has ever happened on the continent of Africa came from the Middle East, and that was called the Trans-Sahara slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, when 11 million people were taken through some of the most gruesome activity on the continent of Africa, from West Africa into the Americas. That was about 11 to 12 million, at best 24 million, depending on who you're talking to, at worst rather, depending on who you're talking to. But the worst of them all was the Trans-Sahara slave trade, where young Africans were shipped through places like in river passages like the Niger into places like Timbuktu for exchange of glass and exchange for salt, while those caravans coming in deep from the south, from the desert, will take slaves, ivory and gold. That in itself was some of the most brutal campaigns, on Africans, in recent time. And I think that there is no way in which we should not be as upset as it is. So each time I see what is happening in North Africa with Africans, Black Africans, it's a reminder, of that huge disaster that was carried out by Arabs on Africans. That being said, if you show up in North America, I can show you 120 million black people, but if you show up in the Madinas, in the Middle East, you can't find a pocket of black Africans. You can't find 5,000 of them anywhere, but yet more than 54 million rather, black Africans were taken as slaves into the Arabians. And the reason for that is because they got masculated. Their male organs were basically chopped off in the Sahara. There was a trail of blood leading sub-Saharan Africa into the Madinas. That we will not forget. The reality is this, that the continent of Africa does not need any of those excesses. We are a very peaceful people, and I think that the moment we begin to educate our young ones on Africa's historic past, educate our young ones that we are way better, that long before the concept of even a trinity in Christianity became something mainstream, we had that in Kemetic civilization. Long before the issues of a virgin birth became mainstream, we had that in Kemetic civilization. And I think that we need to be able to understand, long before there was anything, we had that in Kemetic civilization. We're talking about medicine, we're talking about philosophy, we're talking about anything else, we had that in Kemetic civilization. So time has come for us to understand that ideas like that which ISIS is pushing and ideas like that which Al-Qaeda is pushing is not mainstream. It has nothing to do with us as a people on the continent of Africa, and there's no reason why we should be able to buy into that level of garbage. Africa needs Africans, and the reality is that on the continent of Africa, the Ubuntu spirit must roam supreme. You are because I am, not because of ISIS, not because of Al-Qaeda, because you, an African, me, an African, we are one another's keeper.
We are one another's keeper. Africa needs Africa. We should always defend the Ubuntu spirit, Ubuntu philosophy, Ubuntu ideology. Thank you, immensely, Dr. Stanley FONGOD, for your input on today's edition of the program. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to have you and Harrison, share your insight on this edition of Talking Point over For You Media Africa, the Pan-African channel. Meanwhile, I'll say thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's on that note that we shall be culminating at this edition of Talking Point over your Pan-African channel, For You Media Africa. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. While we're discussing how to fight terrorism on the African continent, we brought forth solutions on how Africa can chart its dream of having a unified task force on the African continent to defend the interests of Africans. Do have a beautiful day in company of our numerous programs.